Welcome back to Crime Documentary Files. Shu Yili was born in 1979 into a prestigious intellectual family in Changzhou, Jiangsu Province, China. Both her parents were well-respected university professors, and as their only child, Yili was their precious gem, cherished and nurtured from the moment she came into this world. She grew up enveloped in her parents' unconditional love, protected like a treasure. From an early age, every step of Yili's life seemed to have been carefully prepared by her parents, a red carpet laid out for her to walk upon with confidence and security. And she never disappointed their expectations, consistently achieving excellent academic results, her report card always showing first place with no one able to take her crown. In 1996, at just 17 years old, with her exceptional intelligence and solid educational foundation, Yili passed the entrance exam for China University of Mining and Technology. She didn't stop there. After completing her undergraduate degree, she continued her academic journey with fierce determination, completing both her master's and doctoral degrees without pause. By 2005, Yili had proudly earned her doctorate and stepped into the lecture halls of Changshu Institute of Technology as a university lecturer, carrying on her family's noble academic tradition. Before meeting that fateful man, Yili's life was nearly flawless, perfect down to the smallest detail. However, it seemed that when heaven blessed her, it inadvertently overlooked one crucial thing. Throughout her youth, Yili lived within the ivory tower of academia, surrounded only by books, research, and decent intellectuals. Everything she knew about the outside world, about the complexities of society, had been filtered through classic texts or her parents' gentle, protective words. Because of this, her soul was so pure and kind that it sometimes seemed disconnected from reality. In her innocent worldview, Yili sincerely believed that as long as there was true love, as long as two people genuinely cared for each other, any obstacle could be overcome. Dong Gangbiao was the wrong man that fate had arranged for Yili to meet. If you compared their lives, you would see they were complete opposites, like two sides of a mirror, one reflecting the bright light of prosperity and education, the other the dark shadows of poverty and hardship. In 1973, Gang Biao was born in a remote mountain village in Jining, Shandong Province. His childhood consisted only of days spent rolling in the mud. When he was still young, his parents divorced, and Gang Biao was given to his mother, Liu Xiuying, to raise. From then on, mother and son began a life of depending solely on each other. In rural China during those years, a divorced woman with a small child faced countless difficulties, not only materially, but also from the judgmental eyes of those around her. Xu Ying was truly a woman with a bitter fate. Before marrying Gang Biao's father, she had already been through 2 failed marriages, giving birth to 3 children with different men, yet none of them stayed with her until the end. These bitter experiences gradually eroded her soul, twisting her once normal personality like a rope wound too tight, unable to ever straighten again. Deep in Xu Ying's heart, no man in this world deserved trust, no man could be relied upon. All of them would eventually betray and leave, just like those before. The only thing she could place her complete faith in, the only thing she could entrust her remaining life to, was her youngest son, Dong Gangbiao. Under such heavy pressure and expectations, Gang Biao proved himself to be a man of ambition. From an early age, he recognized the harsh truth that if he wanted to escape this impoverished mountain village, if he wanted to change his destiny, there was only one path: education. With no money, no connections, no advantages of any kind, books were the only door open to him, and he clung to that door with all his strength. From the rundown elementary school in his village, he passed the exam to enter the key middle school in the county, then continued on to high school. In 1993, Gang Biao became the first college student in the history of his small village. After graduating from college, he worked for 2 years, but then realized that in this society, credentials still determined one's future, so he decided to pursue a master's degree. As soon as he had his master's diploma in hand, he was quickly hired by Changshu Institute of Technology, officially becoming a university lecturer. From a barefoot child in an impoverished rural area rising to become a university lecturer, Gang Biao's story truly sounded inspiring. A poor family's son could still succeed if he worked hard enough. However, alongside those strengths, something else had become deeply ingrained in his bones: the outdated, backward thinking of his mother, Shu Yili. Those beliefs had been branded into him since childhood, like marks from a red-hot iron, impossible to erase. Gang Biao was a filial son. No one could deny that. But his filial piety had crossed normal boundaries. Blind devotion to the point where he could no longer distinguish right from wrong. Perhaps the term "mama's boy" described him best. Despite being a grown man in front of his mother, he would forever remain the obedient child he had always been, never daring to speak up in opposition, not even daring to raise his voice. In 2005, at a faculty social gathering at Changshu Institute of Technology, fate arranged for two people from completely different worlds to meet. Yili was 26 that year, young and beautiful, with an elegant figure and soft, refined speech, radiating the gentleness and intelligence of a well-educated woman. Her appearance was like a sudden ray of light piercing into Gang Biao's dull, dreary world. After asking around about Yili's background, Gang Biao felt both excited and discouraged. Excited because this woman was truly perfect, but discouraged because looking at himself, he had nothing noteworthy. His family was poor, his appearance unremarkable, and at over 30 years old, he was still single. Meanwhile, Yili, with her wealthy family background, high education, and beautiful looks, was exactly the dream wife he could only think about but never dare to hope for. But Gang Biao was not the type to give up easily. After that fateful meeting, he poured all his energy into pursuing Yili. He gave her flowers, gifts, and wrote love letters. When the weather turned cold, he would text reminding her to wear warmer clothes. When it was hot, he wouldn't forget to tell her to drink more water. His attentiveness to even the smallest details was enough to melt any girl's heart. More than that, he told Yili about his difficult childhood, about his years struggling against poverty, about his journey of overcoming hardship to change his destiny through education. Yili, a girl who had grown up in comfort, sheltered by her parents since birth, had never heard such an inspiring story. Her heart was immediately moved, and she began to see the man before her in a completely different light. Gang Biao's hardships captivated her, making her believe that this man had truly faced incredible challenges, that he possessed extraordinary willpower and determination, that he was surely someone worth entrusting her entire life to. Especially whenever he mentioned his mother with the words, "My mother had it so hard, raising me alone wasn't easy at all," Yili felt even more touched. She thought that someone this devoted to his mother, this grateful, must surely be a man of loyalty and integrity, too great a virtue to overlook. Yili quickly fell into this relationship, immersed in the image of the determined, hard-working man she had painted in her mind. But when she happily brought Gang Biao home to meet her family, her parents' reaction was the complete opposite of what she expected. They nearly lost their minds when they saw the man their beloved daughter had brought home. Yili's parents had lived over half their lives, experienced countless things in this world, and their ability to judge people was naturally sharper and more accurate than their naive daughters. They only needed a few minutes to see through Gang Biao's true nature. Wasn't this exactly the type of man born into poverty, seeking every way to climb up by marrying a wealthy wife, and then changing his fortune? They could see at a glance that mismatched social standing was a bottomless pit waiting for their daughter to jump into. The issue wasn't simply about money or different family backgrounds. At the root, these two people had been raised in completely different environments, with different living habits, different outlooks on life, different ways of interacting with others, with nothing in common. These differences might be masked by love in the beginning, but once they lived under the same roof, they would become the source of countless irreconcilable conflicts. It wasn't just Yili's parents who saw the problem. Her friends and colleagues also had nothing good to say about this relationship. Everyone shook their heads in dismay, believing she was heading straight into a dead end. One female colleague of Yili's, who had previously been pursued by Gang Biao for a while, privately sought her out for a frank conversation. She warned Yili, "Gang Biao is not a good person. Don't judge him by appearances. He may look like a respectable university lecturer, but actually he's full of schemes, especially good at calculating his gains and losses. Someone as pure and innocent as you won't be able to live with someone like him. But tragically, none of these sincere warnings reached Yili's ears. At that moment, her mind was filled only with Gang Biao's image and a blind faith in love. She convinced herself that her parents were simply being snobbish, unable to see past her boyfriend's humble origins. As for her friends and colleagues, they must be jealous of her happiness, seeing that she had found a good man and trying to badmouth him. She completely failed to realize that these people were trying to pull her back from the edge of a cliff she was blindly rushing toward. For what she believed was the true love of her life, Yili secretly took the household registration book from her home, and in 2007, without telling anyone, without the presence of family or friends, she and Gang Biao quietly went to register their marriage. What was done was done. By the time her parents found out, it was too late. The Shu parents were so angry their chests ached with pain, unable to believe that the obedient daughter they had raised since childhood could make such a major decision on her own. But what could they do? Their daughter had given her whole heart to this man. The marriage certificate was already signed, and they had no choice but to swallow their bitterness and accept it. Despite their anger and disappointment, the elderly couple couldn't bear to see their daughter suffer, so they set aside all their frustrations and took out the money they had saved their entire lives for retirement to support their daughter's marriage. They consoled themselves by thinking that if they gave her more money and put in more effort, perhaps their daughter would have an easier life later on. Meanwhile, Gang Biao was overjoyed beyond words. He had married a wife who was educated, came from a wealthy family, and was beautiful too. All he could think was that his life was about to reach its peak, that everything would be different from now on. He believed he had been lucky enough to grab a ticket onto the train to a prosperous and fulfilling life, that poverty would now be just a thing of the past, and the future was wide open before him with countless opportunities for advancement. But there was one thing he didn't realize, or perhaps deliberately chose not to think about. With his own hands, he had brought a demon right next to Yili. That demon was none other than his mother. This marriage had been plagued with unresolved problems from the very beginning, latent conflicts just waiting to explode. Before getting married, each of them had been assigned a small apartment by the university, 1 bedroom and 1 living room, modest in size but enough for a single person. After the wedding, the couple moved in together, and the early days of their newlywed life were relatively sweet and peaceful. Then one day, Gang Biao suggested bringing his mother from the countryside to live with them in the city. With her simple nature and tendency to think the best of people, Yili didn't object and even thought it was a good idea. She naively assumed that having her mother-in-law around could help with household chores like cooking and cleaning, making things easier for her. She even innocently reassured herself that since the university had given them 2 apartments, her mother-in-law could easily stay in the other one, each with their own space. Surely no major conflicts would arise. But Yili had completely underestimated her mother-in-law. When Shu Ying came up from the countryside to the city, she had absolutely no intention of setting foot in that other apartment. She had to live with her son, sleep in the same house as her son, just as they had done for the past 30 years. She declared that she must move into the newlyweds' apartment to take better care of her son. What happened next was even more difficult to understand and shocking. As mentioned, the tiny apartment had only 1 bedroom and 1 living room, with just 1 double bed meant for the newlyweds. Yet Shu Ying stubbornly insisted on sleeping right next to her son, demanding that her daughter-in-law Yili either sleep on the floor in the living room or go stay alone in the other apartment. A couple newly married, what logic was there in making them sleep apart? What kind of absurdity was it for a mother-in-law to sleep alongside her son and his wife? Yili was completely stunned. This was the first time she had experienced her mother-in-law's true power, and she realized she had been far too naive in thinking things would be simple, and so the first battle of her marriage officially broke out, right there on the bed in that cramped bedroom. On one side was Shu Ying, wailing and crying loudly, tears and snot streaming down her face, her mouth constantly cursing her son for forgetting his mother now that he had a wife. On the other side was Yili, eyes wide with disbelief at what was happening before her, feeling as though the entire worldview she had built over more than 20 years was being shattered into pieces. As for Gang Biao, the man who should have stepped in to resolve the conflict, he continued using his familiar tactic of keeping the peace, offending no one. He didn't dare say a harsh word to his mother, but he also didn't want his wife to get angry and leave. After thinking it over, he came up with a solution that Yili would probably never forget for the rest of her life. All three of them would squeeze together onto the same bed. And so, one of the most bizarre and unbelievable scenes in the history of Chinese family relations took place every night in that tiny apartment. The son lay in the middle of the bed, his newly married wife on his left, his mother in her 60s on his right. Night after night, Yili had to endure her mother-in-law's thunderous snoring, echoing constantly in her ears. Even more distressing were the woman's eyes, always watching dimly like a searchlight in the darkness. If the young couple wanted even a moment of intimacy, they had to sneak around like thieves, waiting for daytime when the mother-in-law went out for a walk to steal a few private minutes. What kind of life was this? Yili didn't know how many times she had complained and pleaded with her husband about this unbearable situation, hoping he would talk to his mother and find a more reasonable solution. But each time she spoke up, she got the same useless, tiresome response. "My mother raised me all by herself. It wasn't easy for her. Please be understanding and give in to her a little." Those words were like a stone wall, blocking any hope Yili had for change. Finally, with no other options left, Yili had to go find a folding cot and set it up in the living room to sleep, surrendering the bedroom to mother and son. But her mother-in-law showed no sign of guilt or gratitude, instead calmly stating that Yili could sleep wherever she wanted. She would still sleep with her son, and that was not up for discussion. Living in such a household, Yili's breakdown was inevitable. But the sleeping arrangements were just the beginning of the nightmare. Beyond the issue of where to sleep, the daily differences in living habits between her and her mother-in-law nearly drove Yili insane. Xu Ying had brought her rural lifestyle straight to the city, applying her deeply ingrained philosophy of "a little dirt won't kill you" to this home without missing a single habit. She never flushed the toilet after using it, reasoning that you should save up several uses and flush them all at once to save water. Fruit peels, watermelon seed shells, and sunflower seed husks were tossed all over the floor after eating. She also had a particular fondness for picking up discarded items, rummaging through the garbage bins downstairs every day, and bringing back plastic bottles, torn cardboard boxes, and old plastic bags as if they were treasures. The already cramped apartment became filled with all this junk, quickly looking like a miniature junkyard, the air constantly carrying an unpleasant odor. What made Yili even more unbearable was her mother-in-law's water-stealing trick. To keep the water meter from running, Xu Ying would turn the faucet down to a tiny trickle, letting water drip drop by drop, then place every pot and pan in the house underneath to catch it. As a result, the whole apartment was filled with buckets and basins collecting water. Several times when getting up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, Yili would trip over them, leaving her body covered in bruises. But each time she fell, Xu Ying showed no sympathy. Instead, she would angrily scold her for being wasteful, saying she had spilled all the water that had taken so much effort to collect. Day after day passed in tension and suffocation, and the conflict between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law not only failed to diminish, but escalated at a dizzying pace. In that small house, the sound of quarreling became as common as meals. If a day passed without shouting, that was the unusual thing. And in these verbal battles, Yili was always the one who lost miserably. Having grown up in an intellectual environment, accustomed to speaking softly and politely, how could she possibly out-argue a woman who had honed her cursing skills over decades of life in rural China? Xu Ying could spew out the filthiest, most vulgar words without a second thought, each sentence like a sharp knife stabbing directly into Yili's most painful spots. She cursed Yili as a hen that couldn't lay eggs, a fox spirit from the city who had seduced her son, a useless thing who couldn't do anything, just sitting around all day spending money. She even said that marrying her son was Yili's great fortune. As for Gang Biao, the man who should have stepped up to mediate between the two women, he instead became the one pouring oil on the fire, making everything burn even more fiercely. Not only did he fail to defend or comfort his wife with even a single word, but time and again, he openly took his mother's side, turning to blame Yili for not understanding propriety, for not being filial to her elders. He told his wife condescendingly that there was no point in bickering with an old woman, that giving in to his mother a little wouldn't kill her. With her son backing her up so solidly, Shu Ying became even more emboldened, growing increasingly outrageous in how she treated her daughter-in-law. Shu Ying's torments became increasingly cunning and vicious. Whenever cleaning the house, she would accidentally throw away the teaching materials Yili had painstakingly prepared, causing Yili to lose face in front of her students when she stood at the podium. She would also pick Yili's birthday specifically to start trouble, complaining that the food she cooked wasn't good, then urging her son to teach his wife a lesson, turning what should have been a happy day into one of suffering. Once, during a heavy downpour, when Yili came home from work later than usual, she deliberately locked the door from the inside, ignoring her daughter-in-law standing outside in the rain, crying and knocking on the door until her hands bled, calmly sitting inside watching TV as if she heard nothing. In 2007, Yili discovered she was pregnant. This should have been joyful news for the whole family. But instead of easing tensions, this news only made the gunpowder atmosphere in the house even more intense. Yili's parents in Changzhou watched their daughter become thinner and more haggard each time she visited, tormented to the point of being nearly unrecognizable, their hearts aching as if cut by knives. After much deliberation, they concluded that the root cause of all these conflicts was that the apartment was too small. 3 adults crammed into such a tiny space was bound to create problems. Based on this thinking, they made a decision they would regret for the rest of their lives. They took out all the money they had saved their entire lives for retirement and bought their daughter and son-in-law a spacious apartment of about 1,600 square feet in the center of Changshu, paid in full without a penny of debt. To leave their son-in-law no room for complaint, they even agreed to put Gang Biao's name on the property deed. They thought too simply, assuming that with a bigger house, the mother-in-law surely wouldn't be shameless enough to keep crowding in with the young couple. They also assumed that since they had spent so much money, they would at least receive some basic respect from the in-laws. But once again, they were wrong. They had underestimated human greed. The moment the keys to the new house arrived, Shu Ying immediately moved right in without asking anyone's permission. But she didn't stop there. She brazenly took over the garage that came with the apartment and had her eldest son from the countryside, Gang Biao's half-brother on his father's side, pack up and move to the city to stay there as well. Just like that, the house that Yili's parents had emptied their retirement savings to buy for their daughter had become the headquarters of the entire Dong family, gathering all their relatives from the countryside. Meanwhile, Yili's car had nowhere to park and had to sit outside in the residential complex every day, exposed to rain and sun. Around this same time, Shu Ying was diagnosed with gallstones and needed urgent surgery. When Yili's parents heard this news, they didn't gloat or sneer at the misfortune of the person who had been tormenting their daughter for so long. Instead, they took the high road and volunteered to cover all the costs of surgery and treatment for their in-law. On top of that, they gave Gang Biao's sister, who came to care for Shu Ying during her hospital stay and recovery, the equivalent of $1,000 as compensation for her trouble. After she recovered, they even took Shu Ying on a vacation to help her relax and had her chronic eye condition treated. This kind-hearted couple always believed that since they had done so much, spent so much money and effort, they could surely change this mother-in-law. But they were completely wrong. Whenever Shu Ying stood before her in-laws, she would sweetly call them great benefactors and lifesavers, her mouth never stopping with talk of how she couldn't repay this kindness in this life, so she would repay it in the next. But the moment she turned her back, when no one was watching, she treated her daughter-in-law Yili even more cruelly and viciously than before, not reducing her abuse by even the slightest degree. In 2008, Yili gave birth to a baby boy. This should have been a momentous event bringing joy and unity to the family, but the child's arrival did nothing to warm the atmosphere in that home. Shu Ying bluntly declared that she was too old and weak to take care of a young child. On the surface, this sounded reasonable, but behind her refusal was a calculated scheme she had already arranged. She wanted her son and daughter-in-law to invite Gangbiao's sister from the countryside to help with the baby on the condition that they pay about $1,500 a month for childcare. In other words, she wanted to use this opportunity to help her relatives earn a nice income from her daughter-in-law's pocket. But this time, Yili no longer went along with her mother-in-law's arrangements. She was too exhausted from all the scheming and unreasonable demands. After her maternity leave ended, she decided to send her son straight to her parents' home in Changzhou for her own parents to care for. From then on, she had to rush back and forth between the two cities by herself, balancing her teaching job at the university while trying to make time in every spare moment to visit her child. This packed schedule drained every ounce of her energy, leaving her body so exhausted it felt ready to fall apart. But at least she had peaceful moments with her young son, away from the suffocating atmosphere of the house with her terrifying mother-in-law. Around this same time, Gangbiao was busy pursuing his doctoral degree and frequently away from home, sometimes gone for an entire week before returning. Without her son around to keep her in check or serve as witness, Shu Yili completely dropped her final mask and stopped pretending altogether. Her methods of tormenting Yili escalated from verbal abuse and insults to outright physical violence. Whenever her son was away, she would devise every possible way to prevent Yili from even entering the door, sometimes locking the door from inside, sometimes blocking the stairs, treating her daughter-in-law like a stranger who had no right to appear in the house that Yili's own parents had purchased. But what truly pushed Yili to the breaking point, what made her completely lose hope, was the first time Gangbiao raised his hand against her. That day was like any other, another argument erupting over some trivial matter. But this time, Shu Yili had a new trick. In front of her son, who had just returned from his studies, she began sobbing and wailing dramatically, opening the curtain on a play she had staged in advance. Between sobs, she claimed she had cancer, when in reality it was just ordinary cholecystitis, and that she wouldn't live much longer. Yet her daughter-in-law still made her angry every day, truly a heartless woman. The moment Gangbiao heard the word cancer from his mother's lips, his rage instantly flared. Without thinking, without asking questions, he charged straight up to his wife and slapped her hard across the face. His mouth was still muttering curses. "My mother is about to die, and you're still calculating against her? You heartless witch." That slap didn't just strike Yili's face, leaving a red bruise on her cheek. It also shattered the last shred of hope she had held onto for this marriage. She stood frozen, looking at the man before her with his face contorted in anger. In that moment, she suddenly awakened and realized just how wrong she had been. Yili's heart went completely cold, as lifeless as ashes. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just silently picked up her young son and went straight back to her parents' home. This time, her determination was ironclad. She would divorce, she would take her son, and she would completely leave behind that terrifying pair of mother and son. But Yili never imagined that her decision to escape, to free herself from this hellish marriage, would inadvertently strike at the most vital point of that mother-son duo, and that this very decision would bring fatal disaster upon herself. When the word divorce was spoken, it was like a bomb exploding in the middle of the Dong family, causing both mother and son to completely lose control, revealing their true faces of greed and cruelty. For Gangbiao, divorce meant he would lose a perfect wife like Yili, lose the golden ticket he had worked so hard to obtain. He wouldn't just lose his wife. He would also lose her wealthy family behind her, people with money and status who could strongly support his career. But most important of all was the house, the biggest asset he was enjoying. Although his name was on the property deed, everyone knew this house had been paid in full by the Shu family. If they actually went to court to divide assets, he wouldn't have much of an advantage. For Shu Yili, the divorce was even more serious. First, she would lose the house. The spacious 1,600 square foot apartment she was living in as if it were her own would be gone, and she, along with her eldest son's family, who were staying in the garage, would have to pack up and leave, going back to where they came from. But that wasn't what frightened her most. What she absolutely could not accept was that Yili had clearly stated she would take her grandson with her, leaving the Dong family without an heir to carry on the bloodline. In Shu Ying's deeply ingrained traditional thinking, that grandson was her very life, the root and lifeblood of the Dong family. If she lost that grandson, all the hardships she had endured her entire life would become meaningless, completely wasted. Because of this, the moment this mother-son pair, selfish to their very bones, heard the word divorce, they immediately stood united, starting to think of every possible way to keep Yili at any cost. Gang Biao instantly transformed his attitude, switching from the brute who had just slapped his wife to playing the role of a pitiful, remorseful man. He rushed to his in-laws' home, collapsed to his knees before them, crying pathetically while repeatedly kowtowing to the floor, even writing up a lengthy pledge on the spot, swearing up and down that he would never raise his hand again, that he would definitely change, that he would definitely love and care for Yili with all his heart. Yili's parents looked at their tiny grandson, who didn't understand anything yet, and their hearts softened. Once again, they turned to persuade their daughter, telling her to endure a little more for the sake of her child. And so, Yili was once again bound by family ties and maternal love, reluctantly returning to the home that had given her nightmares. But this return brought no improvement. On the contrary, it only made Shu Ying realize she had nothing left to fear. She discovered that although her daughter-in-law talked about divorce, her greatest weakness was the child. As long as she kept a firm grip on the child, she couldn't lose. And so an even more vicious idea began to form in her mind. What if Yili disappeared from this world? If Yili were dead, wouldn't divorce become impossible? The house would rightfully be inherited by Gang Biao as her husband, and the grandson, having lost his mother, would forever belong to the Dong family, wouldn't he? This plan was perfect, so perfect that she felt thrilled by it. This insane idea took root in Shu Ying's mind. From that day on, the way she looked at Yili changed. Yili also vaguely felt something was wrong with her mother-in-law. She later told her mother that her mother-in-law always looked at her with vicious eyes that sent chills down her spine. But the family was still too naive. They never could have imagined that this mother-in-law was calculating how to take her life. Meanwhile, Shu Ying began preparing for her plan. On November 11th, 2010, she made up an excuse about the family motorcycle being out of gas, secretly went to a gas station to buy a container of gasoline, and hid it in the storage room at home. She quietly waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. And that opportunity came very soon. On November 25th, 2010, Gang Biao had to travel for work for a day due to university business. This meant that the next day, only Shu Ying and Yili would be in the house, along with the child. This was heaven, handing her a knife. On November 26th, Yili had an exam the next day, so she didn't go to the university and stayed home to study. She told her mother-in-law that she needed to read and hoped the house could be quiet. But unexpectedly, these words became the spark that ignited the powder keg. In mother-in-law Shu Ying's ears, this wasn't a request. It was clearly an order, a provocation. Never one to back down, she deliberately went to the living room and turned the TV volume up as loud as it would go. The chaotic noise from the program, combined with her deliberate loud laughter, instantly pierced Yili's ears, making it impossible for her to read a single word. Yili truly couldn't take it anymore. She rushed out of the bedroom to argue with her mother-in-law. Years of accumulated grievances and resentment exploded completely in that moment. The two women were screaming at each other over nothing more than the TV volume. In her anger, Yili rushed over and yanked the TV's power cord from the outlet. This action completely infuriated Shu Ying. She looked at her daughter-in-law standing there with her face flushed red with anger, watching her prepare to slam the door and leave. She knew the moment had come. Just as Yili turned around, Shu Ying silently went into the storage room and brought out the container of gasoline she had prepared in advance. Like a ghost, she quietly followed behind Yili. The moment her daughter-in-law reached the living room, Shu Ying lunged forward and dumped the entire container of gasoline down over Yili's head. Yili's hair and clothes were soaked with gasoline streaming down her face. Even more dangerous, the gasoline got into her eyes. Yili was nearsighted and was wearing contact lenses that day. Contact lenses dissolve and deform immediately upon contact with gasoline, then stick tightly to the eyeballs. The intense pain combined with sudden blindness made her instantly lose her balance. Her feet slipped, and she crashed down onto the gasoline-covered floor, completely unable to move. At this moment, Shu Ying looked at her daughter-in-law writhing in agony on the ground, and, without a moment's hesitation, turned and rushed into the kitchen. She pulled the sharpest knife from the knife rack and, using all her strength, brought it down hard. She didn't stop after the first blow. Instead, like a madwoman, she frantically hacked at the same spot again and again. The floor, the walls, the furniture, everywhere was stained deep red. Only after the 12th blow did the house finally fall as silent as death. The only sound was Shu Ying's heavy breathing. Strangely, Shu Ying seemed to feel a sense of calm, as if she had just completed an important task. Like a seasoned killer, she coolly dealt with the aftermath. She went into the bathroom, took off her clothes, carefully washed the stains from her face, then changed into a clean set of clothes. All of this happened while her grandson was still sleeping in the other bedroom. After finishing everything, Shu Ying even had the composure to go outside for a stroll. Several hours later, she casually walked into the nearest police station and turned herself in. The police who arrived at the scene still wonder to this day. How could a 65-year-old woman be capable of such brutality? The case quickly went to court. On December 2, 2011, the Changshu People's Court opened the trial. In court, Shu Ying readily admitted to the killing. But when asked why she did it, she showed not a trace of remorse, instead placing all the blame on Yili. She insisted that her daughter-in-law was unfilial, kept demanding a divorce from her son, and wanted to take her grandson away, pushing her to the point where she momentarily lost control and committed the crime. She even said in front of everyone, "Who did she think she was? She was completely unworthy of my son. Marrying my son was the fortune of 8 lifetimes." As for Yili's parents, who had treated her so well, she merely said lightly, "They were good to me. I'll repay them in the next life." Throughout the trial, one big question hung in everyone's minds. Shu Ying was an illiterate old woman. How could she have known that gasoline could dissolve contact lenses? This didn't seem like knowledge a rural woman would possess. Many people, including Yili's parents, believed that Gang Biao was the true mastermind behind this murder. He had put his mother up to it, and Shu Ying was merely the knife in his hand. But suspicion remained, just suspicion. There was no evidence. At the time of the murder, Gang Biao was away on a business trip with a perfect alibi. When police questioned him, he cleared himself completely, saying he had no knowledge of his mother's plan. And Shu Ying took all the blame upon herself, insisting she had acted alone. Without solid evidence, the law could do nothing to Gang Biao. And Gang Biao's behavior after his wife's tragic death made everyone see exactly what kind of person he was. When reporters interviewed him, he showed not a hint of grief, only complaints. He said, "My mother shouldn't have been so cruel. What she did ruined my whole life, leaving me to live in shadow forever." Listen to that. In his own words, he himself was the most tragic victim of this tragedy. Because Yili had died before the divorce proceedings were completed, legally speaking, Gang Biao was still her husband, still a member of the victim's family. So Gang Biao exploited this status to write a letter of forgiveness for his own mother, Shu Ying. And a letter of forgiveness from the victim's family carried significant weight. Taking into account that Shu Ying had turned herself in, that the case arose from family conflicts, and adding this letter of forgiveness, the court ultimately sentenced Shu Ying to death for intentional homicide with a 2-year suspension of execution. This suspended death sentence caused Yili's parents to collapse on the spot. Their only daughter was gone, and the killer wouldn't pay with her life. They finally saw clearly that this man had never loved their daughter from beginning to end. The only things he loved were himself and his sick family. Shu Ying was sentenced to death with suspension, but she only spent 2 years in prison. In 2013, she was diagnosed with cancer, this time for real. According to the law, she qualified for medical parole, and just like that, she walked out of prison and returned to her son's side. The death sentence pronounced in court had become nothing but a joke. The vicious mother-in-law had escaped legal punishment in a way no one could have predicted. As for Gang Biao, he became the sole winner, the one who benefited most from this bloody case. Today, Gang Biao lives in the house stained with his former wife's blood, drives the car his former in-laws bought, and quickly remarried another young, beautiful woman through matchmaking, even having another child. His career wasn't affected in the slightest. Through his scheming, he was promoted to associate professor a few years later, and that is today's heartbreaking case. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.